Hello, and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Last year, I produced an episode called Bear Brook Murders. It's the story of Bear Brook State Park near Allenstown, New Hampshire, and how, after decades, 2 barrels with human remains were found in the park, first by boys playing hide and seek, and then by a hunter. You don't have to watch that episode before you watch this one, but if you haven't seen it, it will definitely give you some additional insight in today's episode. The Bear Brook story is actually only part of a serial killer story. The story of the man that we're talking about today is actually split kind of into 2 parts. For many, many years, no one was able to put the puzzle together, those 2 parts together. No one knew that the bodies found in the barrels were connected to our subject for today. In fact, today's serial killer used so many names that it was difficult to trace his movements. But finally, we know. Finally, we are aware of the monster who used a lot of names, but whose actual name was Terry Rasmussen. If you recall from the Bear Brook episode, there's a point where I say this is where the story splits into 2 parts. Well, today is part 2. Today we are going to talk about the other victims of this killer, whose names and stories may not be as famous as those attached to the Bear Brook murders, but whose stories are no less horrific. This is the story of serial killer Terry Rasmussen. Let's get into it. December 23rd, 1943. Terry Peter Rasmussen is born in Denver, Colorado. At some point in his childhood, he moved to Phoenix and attended school there until dropping out at age 16. He joined the Navy in 1961 and served for 6 years there. When he got out of the service, he married in 1969, and he and his wife had 4 children together. Terry Rasmussen was a drunk. He was also abusive. In 1975, his wife had had enough, and she packed up and left him, taking the children with her. Terry had been arrested for aggravated assault, and for that reason, it took his wife several years to get the divorce finalized. She and the children only saw Terry once after she left him. He showed up with an unidentified woman in 1976, and they never saw him after that. There is not a lot known about Terry Rasmussen's life. He was constantly on the move. He lived in Arizona, Virginia, Texas, Ohio, Oregon, Hawaii, California. It would probably be easier to name places he didn't live, honestly, than places that he did. But everywhere he went, he seemed to always have a woman and her children with him. That was his MO. He came off as a man who wanted to father someone's children, but that was just a trick to get the woman to take up with him. Terry Rasmussen was no father figure. Terry had some electrician skills, and when he finally settled in Manchester, New Hampshire, he was working at Wambeck Mill and using the name Robert Bob Evans. Terry had a lot of DUIs, and he wasn't legally allowed to drive. He begins using aliases in order to get driver's licenses under different names, because he couldn't get a license in his own name. For a while, his life seemed to be a bit more normal, from what we know. But then in the late 1970s and early 1980s, he got in trouble with the law again. 3 times he wrote bad checks, he was arrested for theft, and he was charged with stealing electricity as well. On paper, he was married to a woman named Elizabeth Evans, but no one ever saw this supposed wife, and there is no record of who she might have been. Terry Rasmussen had ties in California. He had family there, and he also had friends there. In 1978, through some of those friends, he met Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, and they began dating. On Thanksgiving Day of 1978, Marlise got into an argument with her family members. Terry was present during the argument. In a huff, Marlise packed up her things and her children, and they left with Terry Rasmussen. They took the kids with them. The children were 6-year-old Marie Elizabeth Vaughn and 1-year-old Sarah Lynn McWaters. Marlise's family never saw her or the children again. That is because Marlise and her children were lying on the forest floor of a New Hampshire park, stuffed into blue barrels and waiting to be found. We have very little information on how they ended up there, when they were killed, and how they died, but at this point in time, it has been determined that Terry Rasmussen was their killer. There was also a fourth body in the second barrel found, that of a little girl. That little girl has never been identified by name. We don't know who she was in this life, but we know that she was Terry Rasmussen's own biological child. Now, this portion of Terry Rasmussen's story is the story known as the Bear Brook Murders, the story I've previously covered. Today, we are talking about Terry Rasmussen's other victims, his other life, what happened to him, and what he did after he killed the Bear Brook Four. Terry Rasmussen ends up back in New Hampshire around 1981, and he begins dating this woman, Denise Beaudin. Denise had a 6-month-old daughter. We don't have much information on Denise's life with Terry. We don't even know where they were living for a great part of their relationship. After Thanksgiving in 1981, Denise, along with her infant daughter, disappeared with Terry Rasmussen, and her family never saw them again. Her family never reported Denise missing because they knew that Denise had financial problems, and her family assumed she had chosen to disappear to avoid debt collectors. I try not to be too judgmental. Life is difficult, and we all have to do what we have to do to get by. It just always breaks my heart to hear that people let their family members go, especially when they have a baby and then they lose touch. It's sad to me, and it makes it very, very difficult to track them if they do disappear because no one has had any contact with them. It also makes it impossible to know how long those people may have been missing when it's discovered that they are missing. Denise was so far disconnected from her family that no one knew she might no longer be alive. Denise had most likely been murdered by her boyfriend, Terry Rasmussen. When? We don't know. Where? We don't know. Her body has never been found. There is some minuscule chance that she is still alive, but it is a very, very small chance. What we do know is that Terry Rasmussen turned up in an RV park in Scotts Valley, California in 1986, and he had a little girl with him, a 5-year-old that he said was his daughter, Lisa. Terry Rasmussen didn't own an RV. He was living in a camper shell attached to his pickup truck with Lisa, and he worked at the RV park as a handyman on the property in return for renting a space there. At this point in time, Terry Rasmussen was using the name Curtis Kimball as well as the name Gordon Jensen. A lot of people actually refer to him as the Chameleon Killer because he used so many different names. In 1985, Terry had again been arrested for DUI, driving under the influence, in Cypress, California. This time when he was arrested, he had Lisa in the truck with him, so he racked up an additional charge of child endangerment. After not too long at the RV park in Scotts Valley, which was called the Holiday Host RV Park, other residents at that park began to notice that Lisa wasn't being treated properly. Catherine and Richard Decker, residents at the Holiday Host, took a special interest in little Lisa. Terry Rasmussen would often leave Lisa alone for days with other residents of the park, and they were happy to keep her just to know that she was being fed and looked after. At times, Terry Rasmussen would tell the Deckers how difficult his life was. There were times when he would even cry and confess to them that it was too much for him, raising such a young child alone. When the Deckers and others asked Terry what happened to Lisa's mother, they got varying stories. She had died in a car accident. She had cancer. The three of them were at a restaurant that got robbed, and Lisa's mother panicked and ran out into the street and got hit by a car. Terry Rasmussen had an answer for everything, but those answers changed. For a while, Terry worked at the RV park, and Lisa, who was a little too thin, always in dirty clothes, would play with the other kids at the RV park. Then one day, Terry Rasmussen, Gordon Jensen, Curtis Kimball, tells the Deckers that he can't do it anymore. The Deckers have an adult daughter who has always wanted a little girl. They ask Gordon, Terry, if they can take Lisa for a couple of weeks and have her stay with their daughter as kind of a trial run for a possible adoption. The Deckers have their attorney draw up a temporary agreement, and they take Lisa to Southern California. After a week or so, it becomes very apparent that Lisa has been abused terribly. The Deckers contact Child Services, but they don't want Gordon Jensen, Terry, to know that they're onto him. So they start trying to contact him to get him to sign formal adoption papers. But Gordon Jensen is nowhere to be found. He has taken off and left Lisa in the care of the Deckers. Police from San Bernardino then traveled to the Scotts Valley Trailer Park to try and find Gordon Jensen. He's now wanted on child abandonment charges. The owners of the RV park tell police that Gordon is gone. The police ask if there is anything in the park that only Gordon would have touched, and the owners say yes, the new surveillance system. So the police take this surveillance system apart and realize that Gordon Jensen has intentionally wiped his prints off the outside of the CPU, the box, the recording device. So then they decide to take the outside plate off of the CPU, the computer unit, and see if there's fingerprints inside. As they remove the cover plate, turn it over, and dust for prints, there are 8 clear fingerprints visible. Investigators took the prints and entered them into their system. The prints came back not as Terry Rasmussen or Gordon Jensen, but as Curtis Kimball. Police then link Gordon Jensen to the drunk driving arrest, the one where he had Lisa in the truck with him from the previous year. So now they realize they've got a criminal using different names. The problem is they can't find this man anywhere. And the worst part about this, and something that is just so wrong with our system, authorities wouldn't let Lisa stay with the Deckers. They put her in foster care. Why? This just makes no sense. This little girl was with a family who loved her, who wanted her, who had a bond with her, and they ripped her away from that family and put her in foster care? As terrible as that was, at least Lisa was saved from this monster, Terry Rasmussen. She got away from him, and she lived, and that's more than we can say for a lot of people who crossed his path. 1988. Terry Rasmussen is arrested for grand theft auto while using the name Gerry Mockerman. He is taken into custody where he is fingerprinted. Police then realize they've got Gordon Jensen, Curtis Kimball, Gerry Mockerman. It's all the same guy. They still had not linked him to who he really was, Terry Rasmussen. At that time, Terry was arrested and charged with child abandonment when people were able to piece together the fact that he was the same man who had abandoned Lisa with the people at the RV park. So in 1989, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but he took a plea deal wherein he was only charged with the auto theft and not the child abandonment, because I guess the car was more important than the kid. He went to prison for just over a year, and he was paroled in 1990. The very day that this man was paroled, mind you, under the name of Curtis Kimball, he broke his parole and he vanished. For the next 9 years, there is very little information on Terry Rasmussen's life. He had enough electrical skills to find work, and he would work just as much as he absolutely had to in order to buy alcohol and keep his truck running. He always lived as a drifter and never stayed in one place too long. That is what is believed. There are stories here and there of people who knew him, people who worked with him, and of people who are pretty sure they knew him but don't know for certain. In 1999, Terry Rasmussen appears in California. This time, he is calling himself Larry Vanner. He meets this woman here. Her name was Unsung Jun. Unsung Jun was a 45-year-old biochemist working for a company called Syntex. She was very intelligent and she was also very artistic. She loved to paint and she especially loved pottery. She was quite a fascinating woman. She studied all kinds of religions and even traveled around the world by herself. As smart and as educated as she was very uneasy around men, but she was lonely at the same time. She wanted to be in a relationship, but she didn't like dating. I feel like her loneliness and her desire for a partner made her vulnerable and easy to take advantage of, and that breaks my heart. Eunsoon had been single for quite a while, so her family was somewhat surprised when she showed up at a family event with Larry Vanner, aka Terry Rasmussen, and introduced him as her boyfriend. Eunsoon told her family that Larry was a handyman, and she seemed to be head over heels in love with him. Eunsoon's family did not take to Larry Vanner. There was something about him that they did not like. It wasn't just that he was scraggly with long, dirty fingernails. There was something off about him. The family was more than a bit alarmed when Eunsoon moved Larry into her Richmond, California house just weeks after meeting him. Their fears were somewhat quelled when Eunsoon seemed happy and would bring Larry to dinners and events. In 2001, Eunsoon invited her family and friends to a little unofficial backyard marriage ceremony where she and Larry made vows to each other. For a while, all seemed to be well, but then about a year into the relationship, everything changed. Eunsoon stopped coming around. Her family reached out over and over, but they could never convince Eunsoon to attend the events she had always attended, and they knew something was very wrong. Larry Vanner, Terry Rasmussen, had slowly squeezed off Eunsoon's lifeline to everyone who loved her and cared about her, and she was isolated. He had manipulated her to the point that she stayed at home, and soon she had cut off all contact with the outside world. By June of 2002, no one could get a hold of Eunsoon. Every time one of her family members would inquire as to her whereabouts, Larry/Terry had an excuse. She had gone to take care of her sick mother. She was out of town tending to the couple's rental property. For months and months, Larry always had a reason as to why no one could talk to Unsung Jun. Larry/Terry had all kinds of stories as to how Eunsoon didn't like her friends anymore and just wanted to be left alone. Finally, one of Eunsoon's closest friends, this woman named Renee Rose, had had enough. She told Larry, "If you don't let me talk to Eunsoon, I'm calling the police." And when Larry didn't produce Eunsoon, that's exactly what Renee did. Thank heavens for people like Renee. We're always so worried about being too nosy, when the fact of the matter is we should be more involved in our neighbors' and our friends' lives. We should stick our noses in when we're worried, because we see all too often here in the true crime community how a little bit of intervention would have prevented disaster, right? I would much rather be called nosy and told to mind my own business than live with a lifetime of guilt for not sticking my nose in when I thought something was wrong. The police were now investigating this as a missing persons case. Obviously, the first place they went was to Eunsoon's live-in boyfriend, Larry Vanner. They picked him up and brought him in for questioning, and I'm going to show you how that went in the very beginning.
Yesterday morning, I had some things to attend to, but I did call you, I thought, in a reasonable time.
You did?
And at that time, you said that you'd give me a little bit of leeway for a couple of days until I could get my ducks lined up, or whatever term you prefer to use.
And that's true.
So what I was doing was making arrangements to get my ducks lined up.
Okay.
And now you've got me up here.
Okay.
So here I am. Now, okay, we've been through this road already.
Okay.
Everybody is different.
Right.
Law enforcement people are human beings like everybody else. Like every other individual. Now, I haven't talked any more about Eunsoon's problems or my problems because, frankly, you're not my priest,
No.
and you're not my doctor, and both stories have their place. You know, gossip has its place in society sometimes, but I'm just not going to say any more about Eunsoon or myself right now.
Oh,
Because,
with the understanding
I
of
mean,
all.
frankly, no, I'm not going to cut you off. I'm not going to cut you off. And I've always tried to live by the model that there's no defense against the truth. But sometimes it's hard to find out what the truth is. You got one side, the other side, and something down the middle that people might perceive to be the truth.
All right, Larry. Your prints came back. You know your other name, right?
Curtis or Gerald or Jerry or whatever name you're going by this week.
Curtis Kimball.
Curtis Kimball. Or Gerald what's his
Mockerman?
name? Mockerman, right.
Ring a bell?
No.
Yeah, that's who you are, man.
This interview goes on for a very long time, but basically, Larry/Terry tells police that Eunsoon doesn't want to be contacted, and that's that. The police tell Larry Vanner that they are going to fingerprint him, and surprisingly, Larry didn't fight them on that. Within 30 minutes, the police were informed that the man they had in custody was actually Curtis Mayo Kimball. Well, not actually. Are we keeping all this straight? And that he was wanted for jumping parole. As you saw at the end of the interview clip, the police tell Terry Rasmussen that his prints came back belonging to someone else, and that they know full well he is not Larry Vanner. The man is immediately arrested and taken into custody, but Terry isn't talking. He clams up completely. Police still don't know they've got a serial killer sitting in their holding cell. They have no idea just how prolific this monster is. They don't know about the barrels back in Bear Brook. They just know they've got to find Eunsoon. Police officers arrived at Eunsoon's house and went through it. At first, everything seemed to be in order. The house was a little messy, but there were no overt signs of violence. There were no signs of a struggle. There was nothing to indicate something big had happened in the house. But one strange thing they did notice, there were no women's clothing or shoes in the house. Only Larry Vanner's things were in the home. Fortunately, the officers also searched the garage. They opened the sliding garage door, and this is what they saw. The garage was cluttered and full of boxes, art supplies, and of course, Eunsoon's pottery in various stages of finish. Some pieces were complete, some were waiting to be fired. One of the officers then notices a doorway and he enters it. He returns and tells his partner, "You've got to see this." The doorway that he went through led to a crawl space, and it was not empty. As the police officers shined their flashlights down into the crawl space of Unsung Jun's home, this is what they saw. In the middle of that crawl space was an enormous mound of cat litter. The pile was more than 5 feet long and 4 feet wide. There was no odor, but the mound looked very suspicious. Of course, this was very bizarre, and the officers decided to investigate further. There were electrical cords running through the mound as well in order to keep the lights working. The officers called for backup. This was just too strange. They waited for backup to arrive, and when it did, they began to brush away the top layer of cat litter. Not very long after they began, they found it, a mummified human foot wearing a flip-flop. Investigators continued to dig, and they continued to find mummified body parts. Unsung Jun had been murdered by blunt force trauma to the head. She had then been dismembered and buried under a giant pile of cat litter in her own crawl space. This axe was in the corner of the room, and there was quite a bit of blood splatter there. As the forensic investigation was still taking place, detectives were dispatched to local pet stores and pet suppliers. Soon, they found a shop owner who verified that Terry Rasmussen, aka Larry Vanner, had purchased 10 large bags of cat litter from him about the same time Unsung Jun stopped communicating altogether with her family and friends. Within 2 weeks of the discovery of Unsung Jun's body, Larry Vanner, who the police knew was Curtis Kimball, but did not know he was actually Terry Rasmussen, was charged with murder. He ultimately took a plea and he went to prison. As Larry/Curtis/Terry sits in jail, one of the detectives on this case, this woman, Roxanne Grunheid, couldn't let it go. She wanted to know more about this little girl the man had abandoned. Roxanne gets a court order to get blood from Larry Vanner Curtis Kimball, and she has that blood compared with a sample taken from Lisa. They don't match. Lisa is not Larry Vanner's daughter. Now police know Lisa is most likely not Lisa. So Roxanne contacts the San Bernardino police, who had handled Lisa's abandonment 17 years prior. Roxanne tells the police Lisa is actually a missing person. She has to be. The police know where Lisa is at. She's now 22 years old, and so they contact her and tell her the man who abandoned her is not actually her father. Imagine her shock. She has just learned that she may have an entire family out there missing her. The man that she thought was her father that abandoned her is not her father. Lisa had no idea who she was, who her mother was, and now who her father was. It is the investigation into who Lisa is that then leads detectives and genealogists to the Bear Brook Murders. Again, you'll have to watch that episode for that story. So I know this is all very confusing. You could start telling this story from the California angle. You could start telling it from the New Hampshire angle. It's a lot, and I've probably made a couple of mistakes along the way simply because the information is so intertwined. But here is the breakdown. We simply do not have all of the details on how, when, and why on these murders, but this is what we know. Terry Rasmussen killed Unsung Jun and buried her in the crawl space of her home in a pile of cat litter. We know that Terry Rasmussen is involved in the Bear Brook Murders. Again, that's its own story. And we know that Denise Beaudin disappeared when she was with Terry Rasmussen. Again, she has not been found and her body has not been found. So who is Lisa? Lisa is Denise Beaudin's daughter. If you recall from earlier in the story, Denise Beaudin and her 6-month-old daughter disappeared in 1981. Her family assumed she was running from debts she couldn't pay. They never saw her again. It is assumed that at some point, Terry Rasmussen killed Denise, and then he abandoned Lisa at the RV park. Lisa is actually Dawn Beaudin. Dawn Beaudin is now a wife and mother of 3, and she has chosen to keep her identity out of the spotlight. We do know that Dawn met her grandfather, the only one still living from her family, and they keep in touch. She finally knows who she is, and I think that's great. These are the known victims of Terry Rasmussen. We have Marlise Honeychurch, her daughter Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, and her daughter Sarah Lynn McWaters. And we have the unknown girl in the barrel that is Terry Rasmussen's biological daughter. This monster killed his own daughter. We know that Denise Beaudin disappeared while with Terry Rasmussen, and she is presumed murdered by him, and we know that he murdered Unsung Jun. So where is Terry Rasmussen? Long before the bodies in the barrels could be identified, Terry Rasmussen was dead. He died in December of 2010 from lung cancer and pneumonia, 7 years before the identities of the victims in the barrels were uncovered. Those 4 will never receive any type of earthly justice for what was done to them. This man was like a poisonous thorn. He damaged and destroyed everything he touched. He hurt so many people, and what he did can never be undone. Wherever Dawn is, I hope she is living her best life. And wherever Terry Rasmussen is, I hope he's getting what's coming to him. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Hit the like button if you like the video and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to support me. You can also support me by joining my Patreon. For a few dollars a month, if that's what you'd like to give, you will eventually help us donate money to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that cannot be tested because there is no money to do so. That is the ultimate goal here in our community. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.